Hello and welcome to the Just Interesting podcast brought live to you from Mother Russia. And by live, I mean recorded before this has been put out on YouTube or podcast platform of your choice. I'm Robin, and joining me today is Alex. How are you, Alex?
Hello, Robin. And also, you can tell we didn't record this multiple times because, you know, you've decided to go for that intro with the Russian accent, which was impeccable, by the way. That was fantastic.
Oh, thank you.
That was great.
Kind.
Really good. Really good accent.
Pure impulse. Something about our theme tune just really, gets me yearning for the good old days of Stalin and his group.
Okay. Well, we've just started this YouTube video, Robin. So.
Oh yeah, that's true. Ooh, demonetized straight out of the gate. Well, it can only get worse from here because today we will be discussing serial killers who were never caught.
Ooh,
yeah. A fascinating, but sadly quite disturbing and dark subject. So we won't go into too many gruesome details, but we will, of course, be discussing subject matter that some people may find unsettling. So please do be prepared for the dark things we shall be talking about. However, we do hope that at the end of this discussion, there will be some light at the end of the tunnel. Proverbially speaking. But before we get to that, we'll be responding to your comments that you've left on the YouTube versions of this podcast or on the podcast review platform. And before we do that, I will be reading out a riddle. Would you like to hear a riddle, Alex?
I'd love to, Robin. Yeah. Wait, let me guess. Is it an Anglo-Saxon one?
It isn't. This is just bog standard, ordinary riddle.
Okay.
Familiar to anyone from the 20th century onwards.
Okay. We're in the 20th century, Alex. Let's
we've caught up. So, how far can you walk into the woods?
How far can you walk into the woods? Okay, I think I've got an answer. I bet it's like I think I might have a
you're a
good
smart
answer.
cookie. You can get this one. So stay tuned till the end of the episode to learn the answer to this riddle. How far can you walk into the woods? And now, Alex, any comments that you'd like to respond to?
Well, I've got a comment, Robin, from Onslaught524 on our last week's episode of the podcast, Biggest Drug Busts in History. And Onslaught524 says, I'm not saying Martin's absence was the inspiration for today's topic, but someone left that Coke in the White House, and the timing is suspicious.
That's pretty good.
That's pretty good. No, I can confirm that Martin is not responsible for the Coke that was discovered in the White House.
Not this time.
Not this time, anyway.
In fact,
but
not even in America, I don't think
they found out last time, but no, this one definitely wasn't Martin. I can say that much for sure. But yeah, that was a weird story, wasn't it? Whatever happened to that? I don't actually remember.
It seems to have come and gone already.
Was it just there was a bit of Coke found in the White House? Oh, but wasn't it that it was during it was in an area where guests are allowed to visit. So I mean, it could have literally been from anyone.
It could have been anybody, right? Yeah. Although I think everyone secretly expects there's some pretty hard substances amongst White House staffers, right?
I guess
they keep going through the night.
Yeah, you gotta be. Yeah, they're all blazing up in the Situation Room for sure.
But yes, if that was in a public area, then it could have been literally anybody. So it's a bit of a non-story.
Yeah. How about you, Robin? Do you have a comment from our YouTube listeners?
From last week's podcast about biggest drug busts from Captain Wonky, who says, we discussed drug busts, but we also at the end of the episode started discussing our views on decriminalization of drugs and looking at some statistics and facts and studies into it. And Captain Wonky says, purely anecdotally, cannabis helps my mental health and has helped me reduce my medication. Doctors are fully aware. If they do legalize or decriminalize marijuana, I'm fully in favor of 21 plus laws. Most evidence suggests that cannabis won't cause mental health conditions, but can bring them on, for example, in someone under 21 with a predisposition to schizophrenia.
Oh,
also,
okay. That's interesting.
Yeah, I wasn't aware of that. Also, think of the tax money it would bring in. Vegas, for example, charge roughly 20% total tax with a percentage going to drug projects. In California, you have to work with a community and drug user project to be granted a license.
Right. Okay. That makes sense.
Yeah. See, this is good. This is a good, interesting, practical examples of how legalizing drugs and controlling substances can actually be used advantageously, even if you disapprove of the practice of using those drugs. Yeah. But I would like to say a special thank you to Captain Wonky for being a Patreon supporter, and a big thank you to all of our Patreon supporters, YouTube members. You're all wonderful people and you keep this channel going. And in addition to Captain Wonky, I'd like to thank James, Still Not Bitten, Rashad Najar, Caleb Wilkerson, Kurt Jones, John Baker, Janie, Henny Ruffle, The Super Show Podcast, Nicholas Dill, Emmett Tapia, Ahmad, Peaswad, Josh Chomatek, A Filthy Casual, and Simon Workman. Boom.
Ooh. Thank
Amazing.
you all very much for all of your continued support. It really means the world to us, and we couldn't be doing this without you. Thank you. Thank you all. We also, this podcast is not sponsored by this, but we did want to shout out a mutual friend of ours who, at the time of you watching this or listening to this back, is currently doing a Kickstarter project for a board game that they've made, a tabletop card game called Brothers, Sisters, Thieves. And this is a friend of ours called Dan, who was actually he helped design some of the old All-Time Conspiracies merchandise. Sorry,
Yeah,
channel that must not be named merchandise.
He's a terrific artist, and he worked with us creating some of the graphics, particularly the merchandise, and even on our first documentary that we went to a location, he did a lot of the artwork for that episode about Jack the Ripper. And in addition to being a great artist and animator, Dan designs board games, or in this case, a card game. And it's really, really good. It's over on Kickstarter at the moment. It's until August the 11th, I think, is when the campaign concludes.
It's a 2 to 4 player card game in which players compete to be the last gang standing. To do so, they'll be playing cards from 16 families, each made up of 3 siblings, to score and steal points whilst trying to avoid getting busted. I've personally played it. I played it. He did like some game tests with it with some people. So I went and played it when it was still in the prototype phase. And it's honestly, the games take between like 20 minutes and half an hour, but we sat and played it for about 5 hours.
No way.
Because it's quite good. You can keep doing rounds and you get really into it. It's a fantastic game.
Well done, Dan. Yeah, I'm looking forward to playing it. And it's if you go over to the Kickstarter page, there's a trailer made by Dan with a familiar voice.
You might recognize the voice, yeah.
Yeah, maybe might be me.
And as Kickstarters go, it's quite reasonable. You can get a physical copy of the game for as little as £14, I believe. So check it out.
And just to reiterate, not sponsored by Dan. We just like the game so much, we wanted to point it out. Yeah. So you got until August the 11th to get a copy of Brothers, Sisters, Thieves by funding it through Kickstarter.
And if you're on YouTube, we'll pop a link in the description below, I guess.
So, dear sir, would you like to discuss serial killers who are never caught?
I would love to. Yes, absolutely.
Serial killers who got away with it, or at the very least were never caught. Because some interesting twists to your definition of getting away with it. So we thought we would discuss particularly some of the lesser known, or at least less talked about, serial killers. I'm sure many of you listening to this will have heard of at least one of these. But I feel like, at least Alex, you may feel differently, there's a lot that's said, including by us, about Jack the Ripper or
the Zodiac Killer.
Or the Zodiac Killer, yeah. And obviously Zodiac and Jack the Ripper are famous examples of not caught serial killers. But we thought we wouldn't talk about them today. Instead, we would talk about some potentially lesser known ones, or at least less discussed ones. For example, my first one is from Europe, known as the Beast of Mons.
Ooh.
Mons being a town in Belgium, close to the border with France, I believe. Now, this goes back to March 1997, where a police officer drove past some suspicious-looking plastic bags that had been dumped on the side of a road, and upon investigating the bags, found that they were filled with human body parts.
Oh, dear. Oh, no.
And this is very near the town of Mons. When they analysed the body parts in the bags, they found that they contained parts belonging to 3 female victims. Shortly after that, in fact, I think it was the next day, they found more rubbish bags near Mons containing more body parts, all belonging to women, and all of them not just clumsily separated, but in the words of the police, surgically dismembered. There was real precision and skill gone into the dismemberment of these bodies. Now, they discovered more bags elsewhere, and they're all in the region of Mons. They were able to identify some of the victims. In fact, I think they may have identified all of the victims now. They were mostly women in their 30s to their early 40s, most of them with some kind of troubled life. One was a former prostitute, one was an alcoholic or divorced, some just unhappily married women they know from their friends. So there's clearly the killer was targeting these vulnerable women, and it wasn't clear if they had anything in common besides that until police investigated further and found that all of the women spent a fair amount of time near or at the train station in Mons.
Okay. That's interesting.
And they noticed that when they discovered the body parts and they calculated how long they'd been resting in these rubbish bags, they'd all been dumped at weekends.
Interesting. So that's interesting that they can work that out. I'm not doubting that. I'm just finding that's really interesting.
Yes, forensic science can do that. They can tell by the
was
stage of
dumped here on
decomposition.
Saturday. Yeah.
Yeah, basically. So they had someone with some skill at dismemberment and presumably with a day job because they were finding these victims at weekends.
Sure, yeah.
They also seem to have a dark sense of humor because the places that the body parts were dumped all had punny names. So there was the Rue de Dépôt, which means dump street. The Chemin de l'Inquiétude, which is the path of worry. And by the river Aisne, which means hate. And Truy, which means trembles, jitters.
I've got a great idea. This is how you stop this serial killer. Just rename all the streets to very nice, happy things that cannot be misconstrued in any way. Serial killer dealt with. You're welcome.
I mean, they didn't. I don't think they tried that strategy. Maybe would they be willing to travel beyond Mons to find somewhere with a disturbingly dark name?
Yeah.
So the things got so bad, obviously, because of the number of victims, that they called in the FBI to consult because the FBI are one of the most experienced organizations when it comes to serial killers. Pure coincidence, just no comment made about American culture and society there. Just happens to be the case.
Yeah.
And then by July 1997, so that's 4 months after the first victims were discovered, the journalists reported that police were turning to investigating potential religious or occult connections to the crimes.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
So they actually set up a special team called Corpus, which is kind of grim when you think about it.
It's a bit of a grim name, yeah.
Yeah,
interesting.
Yeah, maybe I should have thought of something else. A special task force to track down the serial killer and to set out traps, I guess, by having police officers pose as potential victims in the area where they think the killer operated. But they never succeeded. Now, they blamed the fact that the resources available to the special task force were restricted to the Mons police force budget. So although they had the FBI consulting, they didn't have any special money or police officers brought in from anywhere else in Belgium to help them out. The Mons police force had to do all their normal jobs and this special task force. So I think it was only like 3 or 4 officers.
That seems crazy. That seems insane. So just like if a serial killer is operating in a small area in Belgium, they don't reallocate funds or anything to deal with that. They're just like, deal with that out of your current budget.
Yeah, so it's a local problem. Yeah,
it's a
deal with it locally.
Problem. Yeah, it's a maniac serial killer, but still. Yeah.
There were a list of suspects that the police thought might have been possible. In fact, their first suspect they came up with just within days of finding the first remains, a man who was known for violent crime against women called Marc Dutroux, who in 1996 was jailed for kidnapping 6 girls and murdering at least 2 of them. However, the immediate problem there was that he targeted young teenage girls, whereas the Beast of Mons was targeting older women, many of them mothers.
Yeah, okay, that's the MO doesn't quite align there. Sure.
Doesn't exactly. But that accusation against his case, this Marc Dutroux, who was caught for his crimes, may have distracted from the ability to investigate the case, because he claimed in his defense that he was ordered to kidnap and kill these teenage girls by a secret cabal of paedophiles in the Belgian government.
Interesting. Okay.
Which caused, as you can imagine, a huge political scandal. And then trying by naming him as a suspect, they may have actually hindered their investigation, because it kind of blew the case into notoriety even more than it already deserved for the nature of the killings. In fact, one of the victims was actually a transsexual woman who experienced a special mutilation in death from the Beast of Mons, presumably because the Beast of Mons was sexually assaulting these women, killing them, and in the case of the transsexual, was disappointed to learn that they were not born a cis woman,
so they,
as we would call it today.
Right, okay.
So they really went to town on mutilating their body, which is just horrific.
Wow, gross.
Sadly, none of the other suspects were able to be linked to the killings. But for whatever reason, the killings stopped. The first victims were found in March 1997. Last victim was found in late summer 1997, identified in 1998. But that was it. It just stopped all of a sudden.
And is that...
Although they had a whole host of suspects, they never successfully placed any of them with the killings.
And do you think that's largely due to the police budget at the time, or do you think whoever the killer was in this case was so methodical and so precise with where they dumped their bodies and carried out the killings that they just were never caught? They were just too slippery.
I think you're right. It's all of those above. I can't imagine a task force of just 4 officers being able to effectively deal with this. When you look at, just look at America, for example, when you have a serial killer that reaches the headlines, especially if it's a federal crime, you get the FBI, on it with their local offices and their federal offices. It just kind of seems like they underserved the police who are trying to catch this killer. But also, like you say, this killer was clearly, I would say, seems a bit more intelligent than the average serial killer. With the choice of locations to dump the bodies, even the dumping of the bodies themselves in plastic bags just by the roadside seems a bit kind of intelligent, like some thought was put into it. Almost.
During the Jack the Ripper killings, they thought that or someone thought that he may have had a medical background because of the precise nature of the kind of the mutilations. Was that ever a thought in this case, do you think? Was any of the suspects, were they medical practitioners? Who was the local doctor in Mons? And where was he on the night of the killings?
Well, you're right. The police definitely thought that it was probably someone with medical training, or at least maybe a practicing surgeon of some kind. But their chief suspects, I think one of the problems with them as suspects was that their chief suspects were guilty of other violent crimes, often murder, but not with any kind of medical training and not with the kind of violence and surgical dismemberment that characterized the Beast of Mons murders. For example, there was a suspect called Jacques Antoine, who was actually suggested as late as 2012. He was a French doctor, attacked a woman in Strasbourg in Austria, and his son believed that he was the beast or the butcher of Mons. But this doctor loved guns.
Right.
and was a
Okay.
big fan of guns.
And if he was going to kill anyone, it would have been with a gun. So,
Yes, exactly. Although he was a doctor and he attacked a woman, he didn't kill her, and he was a big gun fan, and he didn't shoot any of his victims. It was clearly much more personal and intimate, the crimes. So
wait, hang on. That's how he was ruled out, because he just likes guns.
Oh, it wasn't just that. It was
So, okay. That just seems like
there was other stuff.
no. This guy didn't stab them and mutilate them.
Yeah.
He really likes guns. If he killed someone, you better believe it was going to be with a gun.
Yeah, that's my defense in court. Like, if I were going to kill someone, I would totally do it like this. I would do that. Yeah.
I'd do it with one of my numerous selection of guns.
So no, and that's it. It's that kind of it's a classic case with unsolved serial killers. Crimes where the list of suspects, each one of them is very compelling in their own way, but there's just something that means you can't quite conclusively tie them to it, which means that the list of suspects can be forever debated. So that was The Butcher or the Beast of Mons. So what's yours, Alex?
Very
What
interesting.
did you bring to the table?
Very interesting. Well, I've also gone headed over to Europe, Robin, taking a trip down to Florence, and
very
I
glamorous.
wanted to talk about the Monster of Florence, which is obviously the nickname. It's not an actual monster. Given to an unidentified serial killer who operated in the countryside surrounding Florence from 1968 to 1985. It's one of Italy's most notorious unsolved murder mysteries. So the killer's modus operandi did involve guns. So maybe we need to look at that doctor again. But they targeted young couples who were parked in secluded areas, usually at night, and he would shoot the couples with a .22 caliber pistol, and then proceeding to engage in mutilation, particularly targeting the female victims' reproductive organs. And the heinous nature of the crimes and the precision with which the killer avoided detection earned him the nickname Il Mostro da Firenze, the Monster of Florence. So the Monster of Florence is believed to have been responsible for at least eight double homicides. So a total of 16 victims. And most of these were young lovers or, couples and people engaged in extramarital affairs as well.
Oh, right. If I may interrupt, this is a lot like the Zodiac Killer. He targeted couples out alone, didn't he?
It is. It's very true, yeah. It's interesting. Yeah. And that kind of film trope, I guess, is kind of inspired by those two crimes, I guess. Like the couple on Lover's Lane. Then she hears a knock on something and she's like, what was that? And then he's like, in the zone. So he's like, oh, I'm sure it was just
it was
the wind.
nothing. It's just a cat. Yeah.
Yeah. And then they turn on the radio and there's an insane asylum down the road and people have just broken out. But over the years, several investigations were conducted to apprehend the killer, but all efforts to identify and capture them were unsuccessful. It became highly sensationalized in the media and was plagued by police errors and false leads, leading to public skepticism and distrust of law enforcement. And interestingly, it was a similar thing in the last one. And I think maybe it was due to the time of when this was happening, but there was also a sort of satanic occult part of this case as well. So because during the investigation into the Monster of Florence killings, authorities explored the possibility of a connection to a satanic sect or cult. And this gained traction due to the ritualistic nature of some of the murders. And apparently there were occult symbols at some of the crime scenes. And the brutal nature of the killings led investigators to consider the involvement of more than one person, possibly working together in a cult-like setting. And I think it was actually in 2001 where police reopened this case file because they believed that a group of between 10 and 12 wealthy, sophisticated Italians orchestrated this ritualized murders over the course of several decades and got away with that. So apparently there was a series of anonymous letters that were questioning key witnesses that had happened in one of the trials. So I'll go into that briefly. So in the early 1980s, police arrested a man called Pietro Pacciani, who was a local farmer with a criminal record, and two of his friends as well, Mario Vanni and Giancarlo Lotti, based on evidence that appeared to link them to the murders. And Pacciani was portrayed as the leader of this satanic cult, and he became the prime suspect in the case. However, there was a trial in 1994 which became known as the Monster of Florence trial, imaginative name, where Pacciani and his co-defendants were acquitted due to lack of sufficient evidence. And many at the time believed that the police and prosecutors had mishandled the case, leading to the failure of the trial. But what was interesting about this is, like, he had a criminal record, yes, but neither of these individuals, none of them seemed like criminal masterminds. They didn't seem like the type of people that would be able to get away with this for decades. So it led to this theory that there was a group of wealthy people that had orchestrated this behind the scenes.
Unexpected theme to tonight's serial killers.
I know, yeah. But I mean, apart from that, there was no real evidence of this. Just the thought that these three men, who were farmers, wouldn't have been able to orchestrate 16 killings over the course of several decades and commit mutilations and still be able to get away with it for this duration of time.
The theory that just at some point they would slip up.
Yeah. And then the fact that these men were on trial and then they were acquitted, but due to lack of evidence, only enhanced the theory because people had distrust they thought someone was pulling the strings behind the scenes, and that's why they were able to get these men off the charges, if that makes sense. Do you know what I mean? When they weren't charged with the murders, that only enforced the people that already believed in this theory that there was a wealthy cabal and some satanic cult pulling the strings. Where have we seen that behind before? The scene. Yeah.
But what are you persuaded by that?
Well, it gets interesting because there's one more element to this that I want to bring up.
Okay.
So there was a journalist looking into these killings called Mario Spezzi. He was an investigative journalist who took a keen interest in the Monster of Florence case and wrote extensively about it. Along with an American author called Douglas Preston, Spezzi co-wrote a book titled The Monster of Florence, which delved into the killings and this investigation. In 2006, Spezzi was arrested by Italian police in connection with the investigation. The police alleged that he tampered with evidence related to the case. However, the charges against him were dropped, and he was released from custody. In 2013, so not that long ago, he was found dead in his home in Florence. His body was discovered in a pool of blood, and he'd been killed by a single gunshot wound.
Ooh.
No suspect was identified or arrested in connection with his murder, and it remains unsolved.
Weird.
So his murder, along with all the others, kind of do add to the mystery and the intrigue surrounding this whole theory of, either police corruption or a mysterious cabal behind the scenes encouraging this. Because there was also some of the ritualistic things surrounding the murders that was interesting. They always happened on a new moon. So like no moon in the sky, dark nights. And there was the kind of genital mutilations and things going on.
Yeah. It's funny, the new moon thing, that reminds me of the book and the film Red Dragon, where the serial killer in that, I think it's called the Tooth Fairy, always kills on a new moon.
Interesting.
And Hannibal Lecter is called in to consult, and he specifically talks about that. So I've seen blood in the moonlight. It appears quite black.
Well, it's interesting that you bring up Hannibal Lecter, because the author of the 1999 book Hannibal, Thomas Harris, was at the hearings, the original hearings of this trial, and that's what inspired him to make his character a psychiatrist,
right?
A fictional killer, Hannibal Lecter.
So he was inspired. He wrote all these books, pretty good books too, actually. Well, maybe not Hannibal, but the other books at least, because he was there. Yeah, exactly. Witnessing the case unfold. Wow. That's interesting. But yeah, the head of Florence's detective force, Michele Giutali, believed that the main suspect and the head of this so-called sect, Pacciani, Michele believed him to be too sloppy to have planned the crimes. They started in 1968.
Yeah, and carried on for decades. So there was just kind of thought that there was no way that he could have carried this out.
I wonder if you go to Florence today, what the perception amongst the local populace is of these killings, whether they still loom large over the community, and whether people as a majority think it was a lone serial killer or this demonic occult cabal behind the scenes. And how would you feel comfortable living in a city if that's... Well, firstly, if there's a serial killer on the loose, and secondly, if you think the serial killer might be working at the behest of
An
evil
evil
group
cabal,
of... Yeah. Would you feel safe living there?
Yeah, probably not. Probably not. But so there's no real evidence of a secret cult behind the scenes, really.
No. Yeah.
And I think when something horrific happens, this is like with all conspiracy theories. When something horrific happens, people almost want there to be something behind the scenes. It's like a known...
it's easier to rationalize
it's
what's going on.
Easy to rationalize. It's the whole thing where at least somebody knows what's happening and it's not pure chaos,
Yeah.
Even if
like Freemasons, Illuminati, behind
exactly.
Jack the Ripper and the assassination of Kennedy, and now this the monster of Florence.
Yeah, it's easier to rationalize that there's an evil cult behind the scenes than these three men just went on an absolute rampage over decades. Yeah, the case still remains a mystery to this day. It does. I think there's a recent story as recent as 2022 where some families of the victims want the case to be reopened because of how the police handled it. And I think maybe that's the same thing with the Mons incident. I think if there's police mishandling of evidence and mishandling of the information and how the case is run, then that only brings about these theories that, there's an evil group working behind the scenes as puppet masters. The police are corrupt. When actually it could just be that they don't have enough funding. They're not equipped to deal with a serial killer. That's why they've got to call in like the FBI and stuff.
It's very much a 20th century phenomenon. I mean, Jack the Ripper is commonly cited as being the world's first serial killer, but that's just the world's first acknowledged serial killer because it's something that, until the age of mass media, people just weren't aware of it as a thing, and therefore police forces weren't aware of it as a thing.
I think that's an important point to emphasize, because I remember when we said that in the video on the last channel, people got annoyed. It's like, there are loads of serial killers before Jack the Ripper, but it was the first time that was recognized as a serial killer, like in the mass media. I guess is the point.
Yeah.
But
I'm obviously... we've talked about it, Elizabeth Bathory recently, on an episode fairly recently, we talked about, people who have killed many, many people, but the concept of a serial killer wasn't familiar to people, even if there were notorious multiple murderers who we would now call serial killers. Do you think it'll ever be solved?
Do you know what? I think there is a possibility. I think there's a good...
Yeah.
Well, I think with all these cases, there's a good possibility. This isn't that far from... it hasn't been too long now. It's not kind of like the Black Dahlia murder where you're kind of thinking too much time's passed.
Yeah,
there have been cases that have been unsolved in this, similar sort of time period that have later been found.
That's very true.
Either the murderer comes forward and confesses, or there's new evidence and there's new ways of gathering DNA and evidence. Obviously, there's one example that we can talk about that happened in recent years. One unsolved serial killer who came to light.
The 23andMe, wasn't it?
Exactly. Yeah. The Golden State Killer.
Was brought to justice through a relative.
Was brought to justice through a relative, DNA. Who was it that they did a 23andMe and they found that their DNA was at the scene of one of the crimes or something? There was a match.
I think it's that. I'll double check this, but I believe it's that the 23andMe, like a lot of these companies who do DNA tests, sell the data. They then form a database of people's DNA, and then they can sell that to other people, one of whom was the police.
Right,
who then were like, oh, this matches DNA sample we've got on the system for these killings, which we've so far not matched to anybody. So then they were able to investigate the relatives of that person and, found the Golden State Killer.
Wow.
I believe that's how it happened, yeah.
So
I don't think 23andMe have an access to the police database on the
23andMe
crime
solved the
scene
case, but
forensics.
It's all about data and gathering data and selling that. Yeah, for sure.
No, that's a good point. Technology is wonderful. And who knows, maybe there'll be something else. The way that DNA has revolutionized forensic crime, maybe some other technique for detecting criminals will emerge in the coming years and allow more recent cases like this to be solved. I don't know. It'll be interesting to see what happens. I have another serial killer, which I'd like to talk about, who I'm not sure this will ever be solved, but it's possible it's already been concluded, if that makes sense.
Okay.
And this is in 2009, just outside Albuquerque in New Mexico, a woman was walking her dog along the West Mesa, which is an underdeveloped area within the city limits, which had been being developed into a housing estate, but because of the 2008 crisis, they'd abandoned the works partway through. But the works did cause the West Mesa to become flooded. But then the waters drained away.
Okay.
And as the woman was walking her dog, the waters that drained away had also washed away the topsoil. And she came across some bones. Well, I assume her dog came across some bones. And she reported these to the police, and further investigation revealed the remains of 11 women.
Right.
All buried in this spot on the West Mesa outside Albuquerque. They were able to date the remains to identify the women, actually. They identified all 11 victims, all women, all but one of them were Hispanic in origin. One of them was a 15-year-old runaway African-American from outside the state. But everyone else was a local and in the sex trade.
Wow.
So there's clearly a pattern here.
Yeah.
And they all went missing between 2001 and 2005.
Wow, so this is quite recent.
Yeah, quite recent. And the spooky thing is that they looked at satellite images of the area from 2005 and on around the dates that the last couple of victims went missing, there are tire tracks in that spot where the remains were found. So obviously these victims had been under the ground for 4 to 8 years. They weren't in the best shape and the evidence trail was pretty cold, but they did come across some suspects, although they've never officially named any suspects. And the reward of $100,000 for information leading to the arrest and conviction of the person responsible or persons responsible has yet to be claimed. Now, one of the prominent suspects was as recent as 2014, a man called Joseph Blee, who was actually arrested and put on trial and convicted for a series of rapes in the 1980s. And he was also suspected at one point of killing a sex worker. And his DNA was located on the inner waistband of a sex worker in Central Avenue in Albuquerque. So
not one of the victims.
Not one of the victims, but a different one.
Okay.
Apparently, though, and one piece of evidence from the West Mesa victims' bodies was a tree tag from a nursery, which was a nursery that Blee used to go to.
Okay,
And
interesting.
They found loads of women's underwear and jewelry that didn't belong to his wife or daughter at his home. And apparently, when he was in prison, his cellmate claimed that Blee mentioned that he had hired the services of several of the West Mesa victims.
Okay, so that seems like a pretty slam dunk case to me.
Yeah, pretty compelling. But he is in jail. And he's in jail for 36 years as of June 2015, but for these rapes he committed in the 1980s, not for anything related to the West Mesa victims.
Right.
However, this doesn't explain, firstly, he's not a known confirmed killer. He's just a suspected killer of one sex worker. And secondly, it's not obvious why the killings took place in that period of time, from 2001 to 2005. And that the fact that he went from rapist of young women, teenagers, in fact, in the 1980s, to murderer of older sex workers in the early 2000s, and then back to being a sex offender after the fact, doesn't quite make sense.
Yeah.
And that's the weakness of the case against him. So why was he suddenly murdering in this 4-year period from 2001 to 2005? And when he's a definite sex offender, and a violent one too, but he's not a murderer necessarily. So there is another suspect who may explain why the killings stopped when they did. And this is a man called Lorenzo Montoya, who lived less than 3 miles from the burial site.
Okay, yeah.
And apparently police found dirt trails leading from his trailer park to the burial site.
Okay, that's pretty sus. Yeah, that's very sus.
Pretty suspect.
Yeah.
He had been arrested twice for violent attacks on sex workers.
Yeah, okay, this is checking out. Yeah.
Yeah. And he, in December 2006, so about a year after the last victim was buried in West Mesa, he did strangle a sex worker to death and was then shot and killed by her boyfriend.
Okay, yeah. Yeah. So
and this coincides with this cessation of killings and burials out in the West Mesa in Albuquerque.
I'm going to go ahead and say that one is solved. That's
bold claim.
Yeah, right. What's the alternative? Like, why would it not be him?
Well, that's the thing. It's interesting, isn't it? Because so this case is officially unsolved, and I think it probably will be unsolved, except there's 2 and definitely 1 very compelling suspects who, just because of the circumstances of what happened to them and the investigation, will never conclusively, unless something new comes to light, be able to connect them to the killings themselves.
Yeah, yeah.
It's just, so we're just like that one shred of evidence missing to definitively connect. And of course, in the legal terms, to also put them on trial and have a guilty verdict.
Of those 2 suspects, who do you think it is?
Oh, I saved the best till last. I think Lorenzo Montoya is definitely the guy. Yeah. It definitely sounds like the guy.
Do you see? So, like with the other guy, his cellmate apparently said, he said that he'd told him that he'd requested the services of some of the victims. Do you think it might be a case where the other guy who's accused, I can't remember his name, but he's
Joseph Blee,
yeah. He's already in prison for, 36 years, you said?
Yes.
Do you think he's thinking like, well, hey, I mean, if I can take the credit for this, then I'll be remembered as a monster, but at least I'll be remembered, It's kind of, some people do that, don't they? Like criminals, they add crimes that they didn't even commit just so they have a bit of a legacy.
Yes, as is, Martin and I we did a podcast about the Boston Strangler a few months ago, and that was one of the features of that case, that it's possible the chief suspects claimed more killings than he actually committed. For the sake of the notoriety. You're right. So, I mean, I guess that's true. In this case, Joseph Blee didn't ever admit to it. It was his cellmate who claimed that he had said he hired them. So I'm willing to believe the cellmate is telling the truth. But there's a difference between saying, oh, I lived in Albuquerque and I hired prostitutes, some of whom were murdered by this guy. I mean, it's a fairly small world, right? If you're hiring prostitutes in a town, I wouldn't be surprised, if you had hired the services of a prostitute who was then murdered by the serial killer. You know, do you get what I'm saying? The probability seems high.
Yeah, that's true.
So it could be rationally explained by that, I think.
Or also, thinking about how the cellmate would have said that. So realistically, the police would have been interviewing the cellmate about those killings. I'm just thinking, what leading questions did the police use in that interview with that cellmate? And also, if the cellmate is, living with this guy who is a rapist, then he's probably a dickhead to actually be a cellmate with. So I could imagine the cellmate just being like, yeah, he said that. Yeah, he totally did it.
Yeah.
Please take him to the electric chair or whatever you've got.
No, yeah, you make a good point. Yeah, how much can we trust that cellmate's word? It's a good point.
Yeah, I don't think he would have brought it up unprompted, basically. Like the police would be asking him about that specific case.
Yeah, he would have, and there was that $100,000 reward as well, don't forget.
Oh, yeah, of course, yeah.
So who knows, he may have come forward with like, hey, I'm going to say something and maybe I'll get some money out of it.
Or a reduced sentence at the very least, maybe he was hoping for.
Yeah, that's true. Yes, if he was in the same cell as Joseph Blee, presumably he'd done something pretty serious, given the nature of Joseph Blee's crimes. And this is it. This is the vagaries and the problems of trying to solve a crime. If as a police officer, if you're not an eyewitness, you have to judge the quality of evidence. And there's so many reasons to question the quality of your evidence when it's eyewitness accounts and hearsay. You just gotta use your judgment, I guess.
Yeah.
But at the same time, the point I want to make with this story is that although it's tragic that justice was not served, absolutely, and it's a horrible thing that happened to the victims and it should never have happened to them, we shouldn't necessarily be too scared that a serial killer case is unsolved, because it could be unsolved because the killer was incarcerated for another crime or killed.
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
So just because there are unsolved serial killers cases out there doesn't mean the serial killer is on the loose and hunting for victims. In fact, we looked up a study, didn't we, Alex?
We did.
Some statisticians made a mathematical model to estimate the number of, based on 20th century data, the number of serial killers or murderers, who get away with their crimes. And the results were this. If there were 1 million murderers, for every 1 million murderers, 659,684 of them would be caught after the first murder and not become serial killers. 539 of them would die before they got caught, but they would be identified after their death. 337,729 would commit 2 or more murders, but of these, only 2,048 would not get caught, which boils down to, and this was your incredible mental maths, Alex, you translated this into basically only 1 in every 500 murderers gets away with it.
Approximately. And you've mentioned my maths there, Robin, and now I'm worried that is totally wrong.
No, it's not wrong. It's not wrong. So this is a mathematical model that is based on all the known serial killings and other statistical probabilities, just to calculate a probability of how many serial killers go uncaught. Because, of course, since we don't catch them, we don't know. We can't know how many serial killers aren't caught, because it's possible that some serial murders that are unsolved actually belonged to a serial killer who was caught for another crime they committed in a different country or a different state in America, a different jurisdiction. It's also possible that some murders aren't identified as murders. Some people are missing and we don't know whatever happened to them. Some people are found dead and it's written off as, it was a car accident, or they tripped and fell, broke their neck and accidentally wrapped their glove around their throat and left those thumbprints, but it's fine. Yeah. Whatever. So this
was meant to be like a make people feel better, note. But it's not coming across that way.
No, I mean, I'm sorry. It's a dark subject, but I thought this was quite encouraging that for every million killers, only 2,000 of them won't get caught. And that's 1 in 500, which is actually, I'm pretty sure there aren't that many killers active in any country at any one time. The murder rate in Britain, for example, is not high enough to sustain 500 killers. So it's
well, I've just looked up one stat, and apparently at any one time, it's believed that there are around 25 to 50 active serial killers in the USA.
But then only 1 in 500 won't get caught. So the chances are they'll get caught.
Exactly, yeah. But I mean, is that much of a comfort? Like that they're not going to... there's a serial killer active, but I'm not concerned because they'll probably get caught at some point. still be careful out there, take all
Of course,
precautions.
yeah. And it doesn't. That's not to take away from the horrendous nature of their crimes, of course.
Yeah.
It's the one thing that always disappointed me about TV shows like Midsummer Murders. I don't know if they have that in the US, but our UK viewers will know what I'm talking about. Or Father Brown or Miss Marple or Hercule Poirot. They normally take 2 or 3 murders to solve the case. And we're supposed to look up to these heroes as, they're geniuses. They can solve the murders. And I always grew up watching them like, you're pretty bad. Like you need quite a lot of victims before you solve your cases.
Yeah. There's no one else in this episode left alive.
I know, like by a process of elimination, there's only one suspect left, Poirot. Did you say it is?
Exactly, yeah.
So yes, thank you, Alex, for bringing the Monster of Florence to this episode. I find that really fascinating and chilling and amusing in a very dark way. The things people do to cope with the tragedy of
so it's interesting that cults, satanic cults, have been part of 2 of the 3 stories that we've brought to the table today.
Yeah, completely unplanned, everyone.
Both
completely
in Europe
unplanned.
as well, which is interesting.
Europeans, what are we going to do?
But no, it's been a really interesting discussion, Robin. Thank you for sharing those stories as well.
Thank you.
I am interested in one thing, though, Robin.
Mm-hmm.
What was the answer to the riddle? Or can I have a guess?
The riddle. Oh, yeah, please have a guess. Do you want to read it up again?
Yes,
first,
please.
For the benefit of all our listeners. The riddle is, how far can you walk into the woods? Ba-ba-ba.
So I don't know what the specific answer will be. I've probably got it completely wrong, but I remember a similar kind of riddle when I was growing up.
Yeah.
Is it like 50% of the way in and then you're walking out of the forest or something like that?
You're pretty spot on, Alex. You're pretty halfway is the
Halfway,
answer.
yeah.
Yes, because after halfway, you're walking out.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, which so nice little logical puzzle there. I like that kind of thing. Well done, sir. Your logical brain is on tonight.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Although I feel like when we went to Epping Forest to walk through it at night, hunting for ghosts, I'm pretty sure we went in the giant circle and we were never actually walking.
We weren't walking into the forest. We weren't walking out. We were just walking around.
We were just walking around a central bit, completely lost in the dark.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, that got creepy towards the end.
That was terrifying. Yeah.
We were like, oh,
and then the
yeah,
magical
creepy.
predator blood that
we're going to
led
see
us
some
out.
ghosts. And then it was like, no, we are actually lost.
And quite scared.
Yeah, and cold.
It was cold. Yeah,
it was freezing.
We shouldn't have gone in October. We should have gone a different time of year.
Yeah.
Oh, dear. Anyways, well, thank you, Alex, for that. Thanks for joining me. Thank you for everyone for listening. Always a pleasure to have your company. And I hope you enjoyed this episode as far as you can enjoy such a sobering topic. And we'll be back next week.
Hopefully with a lighter
discussion.
topic.
Yes, a much lighter topic. And who knows? Maybe all 3 of us will be back for a quiz. We'll see. But if not, we'll see you next time. And don't forget, all of our Patreon supporters and YouTube members can look forward to another episode of A Little More Interesting, exclusive to them on Patreon and YouTube.
Yes. And the last thing we spoke about actually was our thoughts on what's going on Twitter or X at the moment.
That's true.
And we have an extra episode of Musk Watch. So feel free to check that out. And you'll notice that we are no longer, the Twitter logo's gone. It's just at JInterestingYT. You can find us. Because who knows? It's X right now. It could be Twitter again tomorrow. So we're just going to say at JInterestingYT. Or you can follow us I'm at JustAlexing.
I'm at Oldtimer Robin.
So there you go. Yeah. Feel free to message us if you want on any platform of your choice.
Yes, please do get in touch. And thank you for listening. And we'll see you next time.
Bye-bye.